It wasn't until my husband ended up in the emergency on Christmas Eve that it really sunk in how dangerous it is to immigrate. So this is part 2. And this wasn't this Christmas Eve. This was last Christmas Eve. But it's fresh on my mind. And I thought it's really important to share because a lot of y'all haven't heard this story yet. And I don't want to be like a Derek Downer, you know? I'm not here to like squash your dreams or any of that stuff. But one of the reasons why I like to make content like this I like to be a realist. I think it's actually far more empowering, especially if a woman wants to immigrate to another country, that she at least be prepared, right? Financially, legally, like have all the things in order so that you don't put yourself in a position that could be super dangerous. And moving somewhere for a man is one of the most dangerous things you can do as a woman. And I don't even care what country you're talking about. And like I said in my last video, being in his country with his family and his culture and his language and all that stuff immediately isolates you and cuts you off from a community that could pull you out of a dangerous situation. And then immigration in general is not going to be your friend. And I say this as someone with all the privilege, white privilege, able-bodied, cishet, middle class, passport privilege, right? With the US passport. But it didn't become super clear to me how lucky I have been to not end up in the hospital and having to navigate that world without being super fluent until my husband landed in the hospital. So last Christmas Eve, I was with Anthony at his parents' house up in this little village that he grew up in, which is, I don't know, like 45 minutes to an hour away from Lyon, where we live. And we ended up here at 1 a.m. or so. Now, this is such a French story in terms of he ate too much foie gras that night, which is goose liver, which I hate it. I've tried it, but I still don't like it. But it is very fatty and hard to digest. And he was already supposed to get his gallbladder removed soon because he'd had issues with that. But on Christmas Eve, he ate a little bit too much of that, and ice cream and a few other things. And around midnight, he started violently throwing up. Now, as a lot of y'all know, I have really been struggling with French. I moved here not knowing anything other than bonjour. It was really, honestly, the dumbest thing I've ever done. It worked out for me. I have no regrets doing it, but I was living in Spain, learning Spanish. And then I just on a whim decided I didn't want to be there. Spent the summer in Lyon, loved it. And I was like, screw it. I'll figure it out. And this is coming from someone who's lived, in my truck for 5 years. I couch surfed for months and months all over South America. I taught English in South America. I wolfed in Argentina. I worked on a strawberry farm in Patagonia. I was a whitewater raft guide. I worked in the film industry in New York City. Just to give you a little bit of context of it wasn't as big of a deal for someone like me who's used to being terrified and out of my element. I'm comfortable with that. So for someone who's not used to that level of shock to the system, I definitely, please don't do what I did. Or do it, but just come prepared, at least with a pretty good grasp of the language. So I've been, I spend at this point, I have a private tutor to try to help me. I have ADHD. I have I have whatever. I'm not going into all the language stuff. I spend $300 a month trying to learn French. I can't afford that, but I can't afford not at this point. I have so much shame. I have all of these trauma responses that are tied to it that I kind of figured out why I'm freezing, deer in the headlights. I have all this shame, whatever. And so on a good day, I can have conversations one-on-one, whatever, but his family, they don't speak another language. And so they don't understand that when you're speaking your language to someone who's learning that language, that you have to speak a lot slower, that you have to pronounce the whole word instead of cutting it, and you can't use a lot of slang or just sayings. For instance, when I said to a friend here in English, a French girl, I was like, oh, they bailed on us. She was like, bailed? And I'm like, oh, okay, that means to get someone out of jail or it took me forever to figure out or how to explain to her what I was saying without using the term bailed. And so when you're speaking your own language to someone who's learning that language, It is a lot of mental gymnastics to make sure that you are speaking in the easiest way possible for that person to understand you. And they're not used to that. So like no matter how hard they try, they are very hard to understand. And they have an accent too. So as I am trying to figure out what is happening with my husband, who is violently throwing up like every 5 to 10 minutes. Now, also for context, I used to be a wilderness first responder, meaning I could technically deliver a baby in the wilderness. As long as I am 2 hours from definitive care, I could put someone's shoulder back in place. I could do a lot of crazy medical procedures. Not anymore because I haven't recertified, but I had a swiftwater rescue and a wilderness first responder, and I was a whitewater raft guy. I was literally a leader in the wilderness. And so being in a crisis situation and assessing someone's situation in terms of do they need definitive care right now or not, I'm good at that. But when you don't have the language, because A, you don't know all the vocabulary words, but B, because when you're in a crisis, you tend to freeze up. And the last thing I could think of was the French word for thermometer, you know? So trying to communicate to Anthony, who is trying to translate between me and his parents, trying to communicate with his parent and realizing that his skin was cold and clammy, that his temperature was going down at a shocking rate. I know as a wilderness first responder, that is not good. Like that is not, you do not want to be an hour away from a hospital in that situation. So I was like, I don't care if it's Christmas Eve, and of course, luckily, Anthony is not a toxically masculine man. And so his pride wasn't in the way. He was struggling because, he's had gallbladder issues for a while. And so he's had this like throwing up before, and it usually passes. But this was different, and I knew it. I intuitively knew it. And so finally, between me and his mom, like I was trying to communicate, this is bad. We need to go. Like, how do I get someone to take me and him to the emergency room, I haven't felt that helpless in a really long time. And this wasn't even my health. This was his health. If this was me knowing what needs to happen and not being able to communicate that, especially at least I was around Anthony speaks perfect English. But me being in a situation where I need serious help and I can't communicate exactly what's happening, I know you can always find things. And people, after I tried to tell the story last year, they're like, well, you can always Google Translate. I am very quick thinker in these situations, but because of all of my blocks around language, I froze. I could not communicate what I needed to, other than allez, right? I wasn't in like a panic state like that because I know not to panic. But how do you like not panic and be like, I don't want him to die? Like a sense of urgency without panicking. It's hard. Anyway, his dad drives us to the hospital. And when we get there, again, because of the language. And I know one of my best friends lives in Germany. She's been speaking German like perfectly for at least 12 years. She says when her husband got sick, she lost all of her German. This woman is fluent, right? Her kids are German. She lost her grasp of the language in an emergency situation. So that made me feel better. But at the emergency room, I couldn't even remember my address. I'm like, Anyway, they kept him overnight. He had to get bags of fluids. They had to give him anti-vomit medicine, and he still kept vomiting. They had to keep an eye on him all night. He was actually seriously dehydrated and would have not been okay had we not taken him to the ER. And then they wouldn't let me stay, which is another thing. In the US, you can just stay. I have hung out in so many emergency rooms. Here they're like, bye, we'll call ya. I'm like, what? So me and my father-in-law drive back to his parents' house in this little village. And on Christmas Eve, I try to go to sleep, not knowing if my husband is going to die or not, and not knowing who the hell's going to call me and tell me if he's dying, and will I even understand them when I get that call. The doctor finally did call the next day, and I had it on speaker, and his parents like basically translated. They didn't translate, but they were just like, like, y'all, this wasn't even my emergency. And yet All of these serious decisions I could not communicate. Just something to think about before you uproot your life.